Well, anyway, Díomh go léir Carja, you're all very welcome to tonight's meeting, and particularly to our guest, Hilary Tulloch, um, who is an Irish military history expert and genealogist and historian about the Irish in India, about whom she's going to talk tonight. Now, it just occurred to me that practically all of our generation would know somebody who had a connection with India, either our own families or uncles or granduncles or someone like that who had been there. So there's a very strong connection to the Irish and the Indian connection and the Raj. So I find that very interesting. It was a time that completely influenced cultures and countries and economics and everything else. So it's very important from a historical point of view. It also was by coincidence that I was reading on Facebook, I think it was this morning, about John de Courcy Ireland from Dunleary, well, from Kildare, I suppose, but well known in Dunleary over the years. And he was born in Lucknow in India. And he was the son of a military man and distinguished himself in, well, particularly with his connection to the lifeboat society in Ireland. But he was from India too. So as we've all got connections at some level or other, so I'm really looking forward to hearing what Hilary has to tell us about their exploits. And I've certainly heard some of the exploits were rather unsavory, but however, leave that to you, Hilary, to tell us the truth. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Good evening, all.
Hello, Eddie. We're just starting now.
There you go. Started up perfectly. Sharing there.
Are you muting everyone, Shane?
Yes. I was just pausing on you.
It was kind of you to invite me. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, John, and thank you, Shane. I grew up hearing about India from my older relations, many of whom had served in the East in a variety of capacities. As my interest in family history developed, I enjoyed visits to the India Office collection in various archives in London and the stories of the East Indies that I uncovered there. Once I knew I'd be giving this talk about the Irish in India, I thought I should have a look at what each of the main genealogy websites have relating to the subject. Within minutes, I was down the proverbial rabbit hole, in Pondicherry, to be precise. I had landed in the French National Overseas Archives. Suddenly, I was reading the detailed vital records of a cousin of my husband. Previously, I'd only found newspaper records, and now, here were the actual records for several generations of a French family who had lived in the civil state of Pondicherry in the late 18th century. How easy it is to get carried away. However, these are French records centered on French citizens, although Irish people do occasionally appear in these records. I want to share my enthusiasm for one of my favorite library collections for researching family history. That is the India Office collection. It's now held at the British Library, St. Pancras, London. I know that you're most likely to visit these records online, and I've made a list of the websites that I find most useful. The handout will be available on request from Shane. Today, I will focus on the history behind the records, followed by a brief outline of the most helpful websites. The Honourable East India Company, with its headquarters in London, could be considered the first global corporation, the Amazon of its day. And like most successful traders, it kept copious records. This material, over the years, passed through various repositories. It is now in the British Library in the Asian and African Studies Department. These records include a mass of biographical information. Every wealthy or educated family had some connection with the East India Company, and very many ordinary families did too, as soldiers, sailors, craftsmen and traders. The British were in India for 350 years. However, for all but the last 25 of those years, we Irish were the British. To make the fullest use of the documents that are available, we need to understand something of their background. The history of the British in India divides into three main periods: the early years, the age of expansion until the Indian Mutiny, and the British Raj until independence. I'm going to talk briefly about each period. Firstly, the early years. The 16th century was an era of exploration. The Portuguese, shown in green on the map, and Spanish, shown in red, made fantastic discoveries of lands and riches beyond the oceans. Other European powers quickly followed suit. The Dutch, French, and English invested in what until that time had been mythical lands. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I of England granted a royal charter to the East India Company. The company had been formed by London merchant investors to trade with the East Indies, with an eye on the lucrative spice trade. The first trading post, known as a station or factory, was set up on the west coast of India, but it was later replaced by Bombay. By 1647, the company had 23 factories, each under the command of a factor or master merchant. A further factory was opened in 1690 at Calcutta. 4 years after this, a deregulating act was passed by the British Parliament as a result of lobbying by ambitious investors and merchants wanting to establish private trading firms in India. This act allowed any British firm to trade with India, thereby annulling the original charter of 1600, which had restricted trade to the East India Company. By 1717, the Mughal emperor had waived customs duties for trade. The main commodities were cotton, silk, saltpeter, a food preservative and constituent of gunpowder, indigo dye, and tea. 3 years later, 15% of British imports were from India. The East India Company's influence spread, with Fort Marlborough being established in Sumatra, now part of Indonesia. At this time, European competition came from the Dutch East India Company. Aggressive rivalry resulted in the Anglo-Dutch Wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. The French East India Company was established in the 18th century and succeeded the Dutch as Britain's chief rival in Asia. The British-French 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763 was fought over colonial possessions in Europe, North America, and in India. and eventually led to French defeat. However, both the English and French companies had enlisted local Indian rulers to further their cause. And, for the first time, the British East India Company was in conflict with the Indian people. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, Britain surged ahead of its European rivals. Demand for Indian commodities was boosted with the increased availability of raw materials and efficient methods of production. The East India Company became the largest trader in the global market. For ambitious young men, becoming a writer in the East India Company's civil service was seen as the passport to great wealth. This slide shows part of a list of items deemed necessary for a young man to take to India. If he survived 10 years, exiled in a trying and dangerous climate, he expected to go home rich, and the company allowed leeway for creative personal trading, as long as its profits were not affected. In the early days, few women went out to India, so many liaisons took place between East India Company personnel and native women. Racial intermarriage was actively encouraged. Children of such unions were officially referred to as Indo-Britons. The boys could generally be employed in the company's native armies, and the girls were available to marry a subsequent generation of incoming soldiers. Other men chose to remain single until they retired. As time passed, the number of European soldiers' daughters increased, and social attitudes changed. Christian girls were generally in short supply, and they were snapped up as soon as they came of age, with brides of 14, 15, and 16 not uncommon. Life expectancy was low, and young widows often married their husband's colleague. Prosperous East India Company officers who did survive to retire to Britain and Ireland were able to buy estates, businesses, and political power. Next, we move to the age of expansion. This can be divided into 5 categories, culminating in the Great Rebellion of 1857. By the mid-18th century, the now powerful East India Company still experienced threats from the French, and as the company expanded, local insurrection. In its first century and a half, the East India Company used a few hundred soldiers as guards. The great expansion came after 1750, by which time the company had 3,000 regular troops. 25 years later, it had 67,000. Largely Indian, these troops were trained along European lines. They formed the regiments of the 3 separate presidency armies: Bengal, Madras, and Bombay, active from 1749 until 1858. From 1756, the East India Company also engaged British and Irish regiments to spend periods stationed in India. This was the beginning of the British Army in India, which lasted until independence in 1947. This print depicts a recruiting scene from 1877. It is a reproduction of a painting by Elizabeth Lady Butler, from a scene witnessed during her honeymoon in County Kerry. As the East India Company expanded its activities in India, it continued to experience resistance from local rulers. In 1757, Robert Clive led company forces against the last independent Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey. This resulted in the conquest of Bengal, but it estranged the British from the Mughals. Incidentally, Robert Clive was awarded an Irish peerage, Baron Clive of Plassey, County Clare. His estate was centred round the townland of Ballykilty, near the village of Quin, southeast of Ennis. Over the years, the East India Company accrued more and more Indian territory. This was against the wishes of the London directors and the British government. So in 1784, William Pitt's India Act set up a board of control in London to supervise political matters, while the East India Company retained control of commerce and day-to-day administration. This system of dual control remained until the mutiny in 1857. The second area of expansion was that of the administration. The three main factories, Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, in time developed to become the three presidencies of India, each controlling the ever-growing areas around them, with their own armies to protect their interests. Before 1813, the company had a complete monopoly of all trade, east of Africa's Cape of Good Hope, right across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, to South America's Cape Horn. No British subject could go into the area without permission from the East India Company, or live there without a license. In 1813, when the British government felt the East India Company was becoming too powerful, an act was passed allowing the de-restriction of travel to British India. Tradesmen, missionaries, and women were then allowed to go. One of the beneficiaries was the Irish merchant trader, Samuel Bewley, whose ship Hellas was the first to import tea direct to Ireland from China. By 1819, British supremacy in India was undisputed and became a source of great patriotic pride in the post-Waterloo years. However, it was at this point that changes in British policy and attitudes began to store up major problems for the future. The concept of remodelling the country along Western lines flew directly in the face of native customs and the complex network of local privileges. It wasn't just wars that threatened the East India Company. The cholera epidemic of 1819 spread from Bengal nationwide. 10,000 British and Irish troops died, and countless Indians. Between 1736 and 1834, including this period, only 10% of East India Company officers survived to make the final voyage home. On this slide of a burial register for Meerut, I have highlighted the deaths from cholera over 1 week in August 1819. Further military expansion took place. In the early 19th century, the East India Company held power geographically and economically. The company was also highly influential politically. This evolving power was supported by increasing numbers of military personnel. In 1837, there were 41,000 Europeans in India. This is roughly today's population of Drogheda. 90% of these Europeans were soldiers. 20 years later, the three independent armies of the company's presidencies, with some locally raised irregular forces, had expanded to a total of 280,000. The Bengal Army first recruited its soldiers from mercenaries and low-caste volunteers. Later, it was composed largely of high-caste Hindus and land-owning Muslims. Within the army, British officers who from 1809 trained at the company's own academy in Surrey, Addiscombe Military Seminary, always outranked Indians, no matter how long their service. The East India Company had set up recruiting stations in Ireland in the 18th century and had begun recruiting Roman Catholic soldiers a generation before the regular British Army. By 1800, it has been estimated about 55% of recruits to the East India Company armies had Irish origins. By the time of Catholic emancipation in 1829, Irishmen of all backgrounds were playing their part as soldiers in the British Empire. The first half of the 19th century saw the greatest number of Irishmen in uniform. This was at a time when poverty and population pressure were at their most acute in Ireland. And by 1840, the British Army contained a disproportionate number of Irishmen in its ranks. In the private armies of the East India Company, the Irish were even more heavily represented, making up half the European contingent. When the East India Company was abolished in 1858, 9 of the company regiments became part of the British Army. Of these, 7 were assigned Irish territorial affiliations as additional battalions in existing Irish regiments: the Leinsters, the Enniskillings, the Connaught Rangers, the Dublins, 2 battalions, and the Munsters, also 2 battalions. Ireland produced 4 governors of India: Macartney and Moira during the company period, and Mayo and Dufferin under the Raj. This picture shows Richard Burke, 6th Earl of Mayo, who as Viceroy of India did much to promote irrigation, railways, and forestry. He was assassinated in the Andaman Islands whilst visiting a convict settlement, and his body was brought home to Johnstown, County Kildare, where he was buried at the ruined medieval church. The Irish connection with India comes through strongly in Kipling. Indeed, his classic Kim is the story of an Irish soldier's orphan, Kimball O'Hara. A further area of expansion within the East India Company was the China trade. In 1699, after initial trading with Chinese merchants in Java, the East India Company was allowed to trade at Canton. From China, the company bought tea, silk, and porcelain. In return, the Chinese wanted silver. Over the next century, tea became a popular drink in Britain and Ireland, and there was a fear that too much silver was leaving the country to pay for it. To prevent this, the East India Company became involved in a triangular trade by trading opium from India with China. The company encouraged opium growing in India through subsidies. Opium was a valued medicine which could deaden pain, assist sleep, and reduce stress. But it was also seriously addictive, and millions of Chinese became dependent on the drug. Sales of opium were extremely lucrative. After the East India Company's monopoly was abolished in 1834, smuggling of opium into China by European private traders intensified. The Chinese state was deeply disturbed and threatened force. Britain was prepared to defend free trade, and in 1840 they went to war. These opium wars led to a humiliating defeat for the Chinese and a trade treaty which ceded Hong Kong to the British. Religion was expanding too. This slide shows St. Paul's Anglican Cathedral, Calcutta, built between 1839 and 1847. The East India Company appointed Anglican chaplains to the army. The main military stations had churches, but no formal provision was made for other denominations. For others, there were small Catholic missions, often run by Portuguese priests, as well as peripatetic nonconformist ministers. Increasing numbers of Roman Catholic soldiers in the 1820s meant that English-speaking priests were appointed, and within 10 years, funds were provided to build Catholic churches. The slide shows the cathedral basilica over the tomb of Thomas the Apostle, rebuilt by the Portuguese in 1523 and renovated by the British in Gothic style in 1896. The work of missionaries became a more prominent feature of the Irish presence after 1840, with Catholic priests and nuns setting up schools in Madras and other cities. Later in the century, Anglican graduates of Trinity established the Dublin University mission to Chota Nagpur in eastern India, which continues its work today. The growth of tensions between the East India Company and local religious and cultural groups steadily increased. These tensions erupted in the Great Rebellion of 1857. By the time of the Rising, almost 2/3 of India was under British control, the areas shown here in pink. The remaining provinces were ruled by Indian princes, and the East India Company drew up treaties in which the princes kept their privileges, but had to cooperate with the British. Trouble was focused around northern and central India and posed a significant threat to East India Company power in that area. Also known as the Indian Mutiny, the Great Rebellion began in the northern city of Meerut in May 1857, when sepoys in the East India Company's army rose up against the British authorities. Professor Sampson, in her book, The British Empire, writes, "What began as a mutiny quickly escalated to include a number of forms of resistance. Britain's initial response to the rebellion was savage, especially after stories circulated about the rape and murder of British women and children. The following year," Sampson writes, "official policy had become more conciliatory. The East India Company's political authority was replaced by direct rule from London, and Queen Victoria reassured her Indian subjects about Britain's benevolent intention to improve and protect India. But despite the government's promise, this still meant an escalating process of westernization. By the late 19th century, that westernization had helped to create a new Indian nationalism and increasing demands for independence. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the army, the financial system, and the administration in India were reorganized. This began the third period of the British in India, from 1858 to 1947. This is the period known as the British Raj. The India Act of 1859 passed control to the newly established Government of India, and the East India Company was dissolved in 1873. In 1876, Queen Victoria was named Empress of India. In 1859, the army was reorganized. Many of the East India Company native regiments were disbanded, although some, as we saw, became part of the new Indian Army, now termed the British Indian Army. Officers who had served with the East India Company obtained employment under the Government of India in the new Indian Army or other government services, or they returned to their British regiments. Soldiers of the former East India Company armies were given the choice of transfer to the British Army or taking unpensioned discharge. A number, particularly the more senior soldiers, joined the Indian Army's unattached list and held appointments, for example, in the Ordnance Department. A few non-commissioned officers chose to serve out their time after 1861 with native regiments in the Indian Army. The 30 years from around 1861 cover a period in Indian history which saw the start of great political and social change. There was an increasing feeling of mistrust against the British. In turn, British attitudes towards Indians changed, from openness to insularity. British families and their servants now lived in cantonments and no longer openly socialized with Indians. By 1900, the Indian Congress had emerged as an all-India political organization. Muslims, however, were underrepresented, and in 1906, the All India Muslim League was founded. Famines occurred regularly in India, and during the rule of the Mughal emperors, provision was made for these times of hardship by building and stocking enormous grain stores. The East India Company investors were more interested in trade than in long-term provision for the inhabitants, and so the tradition of putting something by had diminished. The late 19th century saw a number of famines in India, including the Great Famine from 1876 to 1878. It has been estimated that between 2 and 5 million Indians perished, but the true number will never be known. As in Ireland, the British government had no formalized policy on how to deal with famines. In 1880, the Famine Commission recommended a strategy to deal with future shortages. This was the first of several commissions set up to help prevent famines on such a huge scale. 2 years before the mutiny, in 1855, recruitment to the civil service changed from nomination to a competitive exam. This allowed able graduates to seek a promising career in the top administrative posts, including the judicial branch. Many young men came from Irish universities, and by the early 1860s, About 30% of Trinity's engineer graduates went to India and worked on large public schemes, such as those for water management and the railways. Can't get this still. In the Indian Civil Service examination of 1863, there were 3 Irishmen in the top 10 of 177 candidates. This cutting from the Kerry Evening Post lists the Irish candidates and their results. One of the infrastructure projects which engaged engineers was the Indian Railways. In 1850, there was no railway line in India, yet by 1929, there were over 66,000 kilometres. Military engineers had contributed to this enormous growth, which later became the responsibility of civilians, except in the northwest frontier province, where it remained a military concern. In 1879, when Bombay on the west coast was linked to Calcutta on the east, the line was opened by the Viceroy, Lord Mayo. It was said to have inspired Jules Verne's book, Around the World in 80 Days. The growth of the railways in India heralded an era of economic boom. However, 2 world wars, with the Great Depression between, caused the rail network to fall into disrepair, and the partition of the state at independence threw much of the remainder into chaos as routes now crossed international borders. For those young men interested in natural history, another opportunity beckoned: the Imperial Forest Department of the Indian Civil Service. It parallels other sectors in its history and organisation, and so is worth looking at. Forest administration in India had been organised on a haphazard basis to supply timber for shipbuilding and to collect revenue. In 1806, the first conservator of forests was appointed, and 60 years later, the Forest Department was established to provide professional advice. The first 3 inspectors general were German, reflecting superior continental expertise. The department was arranged in a rigid hierarchy, initially with senior posts held by men with amateur knowledge of forestry, military officers with hunting experience, medical officers with botanical skills, and tea and coffee planters. Gradually, they were replaced by scientifically trained officers recruited in Britain and Ireland, who joined as assistant deputy conservators. From 1867, after training in Europe, candidates were appointed to one of the Indian provinces. Then from 1885, the academic part of the course was run at the Royal Indian Engineering College at Cooper's Hill in Surrey. 20 years later, the forestry course was transferred to Oxford University, and recruitment changed from exam to selection. Candidates had to have a British University qualification in forestry. The subordinate staff were mostly Asians, with a few Eurasians. In 1891, Indian Rangers became eligible for promotion to the lower ranks of the controlling staff. And in the 1920s, the Imperial Forest Service was fully open to Asians, and forest officers were trained at the Imperial Forest Research Institute at Dehradun, which had been established in 1906. Another part of British administration in India was the police. During this period of change, following the Indian Mutiny, they underwent similar reform to the Forest Department. The Imperial Police was a service providing commanders to staff the state police. Until the 1890s, appointments to the senior grades were made in India, mainly from European officers of the Indian Army. The first open Indian civil service admission exam was held in England in 1893, and the top 10 candidates were appointed probationers in the Indian Imperial Police. Burma, now known as Myanmar, was governed as a province of India until 1937, and law enforcement was provided by the Indian Imperial Police. The writer, George Orwell, served from 1920 to 27, and later wrote about his experiences in the novel Burmese Days. In the photograph, he is the third from the left in the back row. From 1921, direct appointments to the Indian Imperial Police were made by an annual exam held in India and open to all races. To summarize, to understand the records, we should keep in mind the three distinct periods of history of the British and Irish in India. The early years, 1600 to 1750, the Age of Expansion until the Indian Mutiny, 1751 to 1857, and the British Raj until independence, 1858 to 1947. Now, to consider the records, particularly those available online. The main types of material for the whole period consist of documents produced by head office in London, documents sent as information from the East, and colonial office records. For a full list of extant biographical resources, look at Baxter's Guide. Published by Phibis, it is a book I would recommend. The ideal place to research ancestors who went to India between 1600 and 1947 is the British Library in London. However, the most likely place for us to look is online. Some useful websites include Phibis, the Families in British India Society. It has a wonderful database on which you can do a free quick search. One of the treasures is the Phoebe Wiki, an encyclopedia about life in British India. Family Search also has a wiki with a useful introductory page on India genealogy. It has links to its own resources, to other websites, and relevant research tools. The slide shows a general list of available online records, including those on the other main websites, such as the French archives, REL-NOM, where I initially got distracted. The unique records on Family Search include Roman Catholic priesthood candidates, 1724 to 1996, Protestant church records from Gujarat and Madras dioceses, Brahmin and Hindu records, and Punjabi land ownership pedigrees from 1887 to 1958. Ancestry reveals its India collection through its card catalogue. The most useful for Irish people is the category Registers of Employees of the East India Company. I entered the name of my great-uncle born in County Sligo. This is the entry. Ancestry has some other registers for specific years, but the collection is not in any way comprehensive. However, There are also collections of monumental inscriptions, which may not appear elsewhere. Find My Past is the website with the most digitized original records for British India. These include records of service, pensions, wills and probate, embarkation lists, directories, surgeons, casualties, and most importantly, vital records, baptisms, marriages and burials, and British overseas births, marriages and deaths. This baptism register from Madras includes a variety of professions for the fathers. Clerk. Henry Birtles was a writer in the East India Company. Trumpeter, army officer, office clerk, apothecary, cooper, clerk and organist. This was Thomas Ribera, who at the time of his marriage in 1844 was a pith hat maker. Some of the remoter places, or some of the remote places where British and Irish people lived in India, were a long way from a church. This is a record of marriages of civilians where no Anglican clergyman was present. Conducting the ceremony in the place of a Church of Ireland, a Church of England clergyman, or Church of Ireland clergyman, were a French priest, a nonconformist clergyman, a lay reader, the Indian Civil Service resident, and the district collector, Indian Civil Service. Among the India Office records, there is a useful category called cadet papers. These have been digitized by Find My Past. This slide shows the first sheet of the application form submitted by Robert Adair Macnaughton, born in 1796 at Ballywillan, County Antrim. On Find My Past, under the category British India Office Births and Baptisms, scroll down to a section Learn about these records. Under the entry Key Facts about the British India Office Birth and Baptism records are several points. The final two refer to these applications or cadet papers. The importance of these records is that as application forms for East India Company cadetships at their training establishments, they sometimes include certificates of baptism, which for Church of Ireland folk can be the only record of their birth. Many Church of Ireland registers were destroyed in the Four Courts fire in 1922. This slide, I'm afraid, is slightly fuzzy. It hasn't enlarged very well. It shows a detail of the certificate for the birth of Philip McKeever, born 17th of September, 1786. He was the son of Philip McKeever Sr. of the parish of Ramone, Ballycastle, County Antrim. It is taken from a private register of births and signed by the young man's father and the Reverend Charles Hill, Vicar of Ramone and Calfeitrin, plus the church wardens and a Justice of the Peace. In the Church of Ireland table of registers, which you can find on the RCB library website, the first recorded baptism register for the parish of Ramone, Diocese of Connor, is dated 1805 to 1879. It is described as lost, deposited in the Public Record Office of Ireland before 1922. Even this would not have included such an early birth. But for this enclosure with his cadet papers, Philip McKeever's birth in 1786 would not have been officially recorded. The cadet papers, often several pages long, may include details of family circumstances and letters of reference, This 1828 application for John Patrick MacDermot shows that he was educated in Galway, that his parents are dead, and his guardian is a relative, the Reverend Oliver Carey of Hazelbrook, Roscommon. The Reverend Mahon, Vicar of Kiltruston, states that the birth took place in his parish on or about the month of May 1809, although, he writes, there are no entries in Kiltruston Register before 1811. Again, the only evidence for even this approximate birth date lies in young MacDermot's application form. On the Find My Past website, there is no such category as cadet papers, either under births or military, although the entries usually appear when you search a name, but it can be most frustrating. Nevertheless, Find My Past has digitized more records for the British in India than any other website. A few other useful websites include the British Association for Cemeteries in Asia, BACSA. This organization records gravestones, mainly in South Asia, but extends to places where the East India Company was engaged, ranging from Aden in the west, Macau in the east, and Indonesia in the south. Cabristan Archives, founded by the late Eileen Hewson, is an outlet for work on both Old Irish and Indian graveyards, now found on the Cabristan Bookshop website. And not least, the British Library website, Family History in India. There are pathways to documents, including those not yet online, personal papers and diaries, photographs and printed books. This embarkation list gives an idea of the number of Irish soldiers travelling out to Madras in 1843, before the Great Irish Famine. Note that 2 of the men are travelling with wives and children. There are also guides to different aspects of the India Office collection and links to other potentially useful archives. To conclude, a wealth of material was amassed in each of the 3 periods during the 350 years that the British and Irish held sway in India. It is a wonderful collection, just waiting to be explored. Find My Past has been steadily digitizing name-rich records from the India Office collection. It is the most useful website for researching Irish people who might have disappeared to Asia between the 18th and 20th centuries. For the list of records available on Find My Past and other useful online records, please ask Shane for the PDF handout. However, next time you visit London, take a couple of hours and visit the British Library. Take out a reader's ticket, go to the Asian and African Studies reading room and have a look at the India Office collection. There is lots of interest on the shelves. Never mind the papers that you may have ordered. You might just loosen a brick in the proverbial wall. I'll be delighted to take questions. This is a vast subject and I barely touched on many aspects. For those of you who are members of the North of Ireland Family History Society, you may remember that the spring edition of North Irish Roots 2022 focused on tracing Irish ancestors in India. It has lots of helpful information. And the autumn edition of the 2022 Fibbis Journal has an article by the treasurer of the North of Ireland Family History Society about his childhood in Ceylon.
Hilary, may I take this opportunity of thanking you so much. That was such a meticulously researched subject and beautifully presented as well.